What do you do if another country starts getting some big ideas about how your territory should become theirs? It's as pertinent a question to answer as it's always been, given Russia's attempted annexation of Ukraine and Venezuela's threats to annex large parts of Guyana. And let's not forget that the United States isn't shy of launching military campaigns against other countries. Both Iraq and Afghanistan have faced its wrath in the 20th century. There will always be leaders who want to expand their power bases or take over other countries for nationalistic or personal glory. But these leaders have to pick their targets carefully. Go against the wrong foe and you might find yourself locked in a war you simply cannot win. And that brings us to this list. Here we're going to look at 8 countries that are practically impossible to invade in 2024. But first, some caveats. We're assuming that invasion means the use of conventional forces to take over another country's territory. It doesn't mean launching nukes to destroy that territory and then claiming it as your own after the fact. That wouldn't be an invasion. It would be a match thrown onto a tinderbox that sparks global conflict. Second, we're not talking about invasion solely from the perspective of successfully defeating a country on its own turf. To conduct a real invasion, you not only need to beat your foe but impose your will on the territory so that the foe isn't able to rise up and beat you back later. Invasion is about control, and there will be a handful of entries on this list that exemplify this thinking as we go on. With all that being said, let's start with a country that has historically been impossible to invade, and still is as we enter 2024. Number 8. Russia. Sheer landmass. That has always been Russia's territorial advantage for centuries, and is as relevant today as it always was. It's the largest country in the world in terms of landmass, and frankly, it's not even close. According to World Population Review, Russia is 10.63 million square miles and takes up over 11% of Earth's land area. The next nearest country is Canada, which is massive with its 6.2 million square miles of territory. But it's not just the size of Russia that makes it impossible to invade, it's also the climate. Russia is extremely cold during the winter, with Reuters reporting in December 2023 that Siberia, a vast Russian and Kazakhstani region, recorded far below freezing temperatures of negative 68.8 degrees Fahrenheit. At that same time, Moscow experienced record snowfall, blanketed by blizzards that disrupted everything from flights to everyday life. So not only does an invading force have to navigate massive areas just to get anywhere near Russia's most important cities, but it'll have to either restrict its forces to the warmer months of the year or trudge along in temperatures that are simply unsafe for an extended period. And all along the way, they'll face Russian forces that understand cold weather warfare better than anybody else. While the invading country is trying to figure out how to make even a small amount of progress, it would be blanketed by aerial assaults as Moscow pulls its troops back to fortifications. Let's say the ground troops manage to make it through the snowfields. Now they're exhausted, and they have to face Russian troops that are fortified and well-rested. There's no getting around the fact that Russia is too cold to invade. Prospects don't get much better if a country tries to invade from the north. While Russia's huge coastline would make it seem like a good prospect for a coastal invasion, boats would still need to make their way through the Arctic Ocean. Guess what that means? More freezing temperatures while trying to fend off Russian defenses. There's also the small matter of Russia having one of the world's most powerful militaries. Global firepower ranks it second in the world, just behind the United States, with Russia having over 1.2 million people in its military, spread across its active forces, reserves, and paramilitary troops. Even if, by some miracle, an invader was able to navigate the terrain, it would then be faced with an army that would likely overwhelm it in sheer numbers. Adding to all of this, Russia's agricultural sector, particularly its grain industry, produces enough food to make Russia self-sufficient, and an invader would have a problem. The country's military would hunker down and let its enemies exhaust themselves before sending them packing. So Russia can rely on its sheer landmass to fend off invaders. Our next country might not be as big, though it is far from small, but it is more populous. Number 7. China. When you combine China's active military personnel with its reserves and its paramilitary, you get 3.135 million people. That's according to Global Firepower, which ranks China as the 3rd strongest military power in the world. Add to the fact that China is a country of over 1.4 billion people, over 600 million of whom are fit for military service, with another 19.7 million reaching military age per year. Now it's clear to see the problem for an invading force. China has more people to throw at anybody who broaches its territory than practically any other country in the world. However, manpower alone is not enough to fend off an invasion, a fact of which China is all too aware. That's why its president Xi Jinping has spent the last few years overhauling the country's military, modernizing it to the point where it can compete with almost any in the world. And the equipment keeps coming. China has nukes. It has intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. The country has a fleet of modern helicopters and fighter jets, along with a powerful navy that's focused primarily on protecting its coastline. China's military-industrial complex simply cannot be stopped. Xi spent $227.79 billion on China's military in 2023. At least that's the figure that Beijing announced. The reality may be that its budget's probably closer to $700 billion per year when its purchasing power is taken into account. For instance, China spends about a 16th of what America spends on the average soldier, meaning the country can maintain its massive military force at a fraction of the cost of the country, which would likely be its biggest threat. Then there's the terrain issue. China's mountainous terrain is one of its biggest advantages because it can rely on its own geography to stop any large mechanized forces in its tracks. China is well aware of this too, having built a massive mechanized force to take on any that get through this terrain. There's no good route into China. India may offer an option, though China's well aware of that threat. It has troops stationed along the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, to let invaders using India, or even India itself, know that they're not getting in without a fight. Invasion from the sea is not a possibility either, thanks to China's massive naval fleet of 730 assets, including over 100 patrol vessels and 78 submarines. And then, of course, there's the concept of Datong. Roughly translated to Great Unity, Datong is the philosophy of working together toward the common good. It's a philosophy that Xi leans on to extend his power base throughout Asia, and it's one that he would use to motivate Chinese forces to fight tooth and nail to defend their home in the case of an invasion. With that, two of the largest military nations in the world are covered. Next up, a choice that isn't as obvious. Number 6. Mongolia. Unlike other countries that we've looked at so far, Mongolia is far from a global military power. Global Firepower ranks it at 99th out of 145 countries that it examines each year, placing Mongolia at the lower end of the middle of the pack. Its army has a fairly sparse 35,000 people, with its air force being practically non-existent thanks to the country only having 6 combat-ready craft. As for navy, Mongolia doesn't have one. It's a landlocked country, meaning that invasion from the coast is impossible. Why spend resources on something that you don't need? Still, Mongolia has seen a steep decline from its glory days as the center of one of Asia's largest empires, and its lack of military force would seem to make it a prime candidate for an invasion, were it not for one thing: the 2 countries that it borders. Mongolia is tucked between Russia and China, with the country's leaders having been smart enough to have curried the favor of both. According to the diplomat, Mongolia's cooperative arrangements with both stretch far beyond the times of Putin and Xi. As long as it can maintain its balancing act, it has no threat of invasion from either. After all, both Russia and China would have too much to lose if the other invaded Mongolia. The classic befriending the biggest guys in the yard method of defense. Mongolia is also a resource-rich country, with coal and fluorite deposits combined with a host of valuable metals that include copper, silver, and gold. Russia and China have strong trade relationships with Mongolia, giving each access to these resources, and neither would be happy with the other launching an invasion. China would try to repel Russia, Moscow would fight back against Beijing. That leaves Mongolia in the interesting position of being able to rely on one for defense against the other, while also depending on both to defend it against any other country that might come sniffing. It also has some geographical advantages. The Hengyang Mountains extend for about 500 miles throughout the northwest and southeast of Mongolia, making it difficult for any country to launch an air attack. If invaders went along the ground, they'd have to navigate vast swaths of steppes, which are not only cold but arid, with very little rain provided to support the troops. In fact, National Geographic suggests that the main reason the famous Genghis Khan was able to build his empire out of Mongolia was a 15-year run of mild weather and helpful rains, allowing his troops to make the trek through the steppes into other territories. That territory isn't easy to overcome, and when combined with Mongolia's alliances with China and Russia, both of which are served by self-interest, there is little threat posed to this remote mountainous nation. But from Mongolia, we now move to a country that's been invaded unsuccessfully several times. Number 5. Vietnam. You may wonder how Vietnam managed to make it onto the list. After all, France managed to invade Vietnam, claiming it as its territory in the mid-19th century, and yet the European superpower is no longer in control of the country. Neither is the United States, which launched its own failed invasion in the 1960s, nor China, which tried to invade in the late 1970s. Why did these invasions fail? The simple answer is that fighting never stops in Vietnam once an invading force tries to occupy it. France, which held the country for nearly a century, discovered this firsthand when Ho Chi Minh led a 4-month siege against its Dien Bien Phu garrison in 1954. Dien Bien Phu fell and the French left, clearly deciding that Vietnam was more trouble than it was worth. The US learned that same lesson during its invasion, which started in 1964 following a Vietnamese attack on the USS Maddox and ending with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. Over the course of a decade, Vietnam's guerrilla warfare tactics had made it practically impossible for the US to win the war, forcing the much larger country into a battle of attrition that it was all too happy to leave behind. As for China, it tried to oust Vietnamese forces from Cambodia in the late 1970s. It failed, partly because of the looming threat of the Soviet Union, and partly because battle-hardened Vietnamese troops were far more capable than the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, at the time. In short, Vietnam fights hard. It fights to stop invaders from entering, and once they're there, it fights to get rid of them. Maintaining a presence in Vietnam requires constant alertness, as an attack could occur at any moment. But that's not all. As American forces discovered during their country's invasion, fighting Vietnamese soldiers in Vietnam is no easy task. The country is saturated in deep jungle terrain, which provides the camouflage necessary for guerrilla warfare and is just as dangerous to troops as the Vietnamese fighters hiding inside of it. Any force that wants to take over the country needs to confront the jungle problem, with no nation having discovered the trick to it yet. So it's not impossible to invade Vietnam. History shows us that other countries can enter easily enough, as well as establish strong military presences. But fighting a war there and defending against soldiers who won't stop fighting makes Vietnam an impossible invasion target simply because the people will not be pacified. Next up is a country that shares several parallels with Vietnam. Number 4. Afghanistan. Just like Vietnam, Afghanistan has a long history of repelling invading forces, either at its borders or by dispelling them once they've arrived. Britain discovered this when it attempted to invade in the 1840s. By this point, the British Empire was at its peak, with the UK having established that it could take on almost any country and colonize it. Not so with Afghanistan. A combination of the country's rugged terrain and unforgiving weather, coupled with its fractured politics that continued to this day, made Afghanistan almost impossible to subdue. When the Soviet Union invaded over a century later, it overcame some of the terrain problems by airdropping troops into the country. They succeeded in poisoning the country's president and installing a puppet leader named Babrak Karmal. But the Afghans didn't take this invasion lying down. A brutal 9-year war followed, marked by civil conflict and fighting against the Soviets, that eventually led to Russia withdrawing in 1989. The country was wounded, it had lost thousands of soldiers, and according to the History Channel, about 1 million civilians, but it was still standing. A little over 10 years later, it was America's turn to invade. Like the Soviet Union, it managed to create a strong presence in Afghanistan, even going so far as to install a US-friendly leader and train the country's security forces. But it was all for naught. After nearly 20 years in the country, America was forced to withdraw when the Taliban launched an assault on Kabul in 2021. The Taliban succeeded, America withdrew, and once again Afghanistan, for better or worse, had repelled its invaders. In short, this is a country with a long history of being invaded only to reclaim its semblance of independence. And like Vietnam, one of the main reasons Afghanistan is impossible to conquer is that it's simply far too much trouble than it's worth to maintain a presence in the country. Political and religious fractures abound, with the latter issue being especially problematic. Fueled by religious fervor, the likes of the Taliban won't stop fighting until they're all dead. An invading force can't merely claim the territory as their own. It has to eradicate huge numbers of Afghanis, and even then it'll find itself fighting skirmishes against more. Unless total destruction is an option, and it typically isn't for an invading force that wants ownership of valuable territory and resources, Afghanistan cannot be controlled. Invaders might get in, but it won't be long before they really want to get out. But moving on from a country that repels invading forces, our next entry is one that's so heavily fortified, there's simply no chance of entry. Number 3. Switzerland. Quality engineering is a hallmark of Switzerland, Anyone who appreciates the craftsmanship of a Swiss watch can tell you that. But the country really comes into its own when it comes to fortifications. Switzerland is already tough to invade because of its location. Surrounded by the Swiss Alps, its mountainous borders are challenging to traverse, and they're so high that it's difficult to launch any aerial offensive without being spotted and repelled. The Alps are essentially a giant roadblock for any invading forces. They're also a roadblock that Switzerland uses to amazing effect. Let's start with the mountain paths troops must have to traverse to get into the country. These jagged and rocky paths, as well as the many tunnels and bridges installed along Switzerland's borders, are prepped to explode at any moment. All told, we know of 3,000 points of explosion in the country, according to the Swiss Times, and there may be many more points that aren't public knowledge. So any army that tries to invade doesn't just have difficult terrain to worry about, it also has the prospect of the very ground underneath it or the ceilings above it caving in at a moment's notice. But wait, there's more. Nestled within the Swiss Alps are bunkers into which the country's military can retreat whenever needed. These bunkers provide shelter and the perfect place to work out tactics, with current estimates stating there are likely 20,000 of them, mostly in the mountains, with many being interconnected. As an invading country marches overhead, the Swiss can ready attacks from underground fortresses that are almost impossible to spot. The country is even ready for a nuclear war. When nuclear conflict became a distinct possibility during the Cold War, Swiss authorities set about building over 300,000 bunkers to house the country's population of a little over 8 million people. Most of these bunkers are still operational, so even if a country gives up on trying to bypass the Alps, it'll find that nuclear and missile strikes won't be especially effective. The Swiss will simply retreat to their bunkers and emerge later ready to keep on fighting. Switzerland's engineers have turned the country into an impossible nut to crack, and nobody knew that better than Adolf Hitler, whose failed invasion attempt resulted in his Nazi forces getting turned back. He never did get to pop the, quote, pimple of Europe. Gross. And neither will anybody else. But if one country were to stand a chance, no matter how remote, it would be the next on our list. Number 2. The United States. Let's start with the most obvious. The United States has the most powerful military in the world. Any country that manages to breach its shores will be met with the most technologically advanced weaponry on the planet, as well as a military that numbers 1.39 million active members. Add nearly 450,000 reserves to that list, and any invading force needs to come with an army that's large enough to compare. Only China or perhaps Russia would stand a chance. But it's not just the military that invaders would have to contend with. America also has one of the most well-armed civilian populations in the world, with Statista estimating that 45% of the country's households have at least one gun as of 2022. Granted, we can't assume that every gun owner would take to the streets and join in the fighting, but if the alternative is to lose the freedom that is the cornerstone of America, you could bet that America's armed forces would be backed by civilians either enlisting or fighting to protect their own families. Then there are the militia groups. Nobody knows exactly how many of these groups, which are small collectives of armed civilians, exist in the U.S. The Southern Poverty Law Center identified 165 back in 2016, but there are likely several hundred more who are constantly training to fight. These groups may not agree with America's direction and are often formed in response to members wishing to exercise their own brand of, quote, freedom. But they would take to invaders very poorly. Regardless of how effective militias may actually be in the theater of war, they'd at least be another issue that an invading country would have to consider. That is, if they could even get into the U.S. America's main threats are China and Russia, which are separated from the United States by the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Crossing those vast bodies of water would be perilous, especially when the U.S. has destroyers, submarines, and other deep-water vessels that can scupper untold numbers of ships before they ever make it to the States. Even the Bering Strait, which could be Russia's point of entry for an invasion, would likely become a bottleneck, with any forces that landed then having to fight through Alaska to get to the continental U.S. So beneficial geography makes America as impossible to invade as its powerful armed forces. And the ultimate entry into our list benefits from both too. Number 1. India. To the north of India sit the Himalayan Mountains, a collection of ranges so large that they're practically impossible for ground troops to traverse or aerial forces to fly over without being detected. In the northwest is the Thar Desert, an arid span of terrain that covers 77,000 square miles and can reach temperatures easily exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Venture to the southwest and the terrain changes. There are no mountains or deserts. Instead, invading forces will be met with wet and tropical forest land that saps strength and provides plenty of cover for Indian ambushes. When it comes to geography, India may have won the global war lottery. Any invading forces that try to get into the country via its southern coast will be met with a strong navy that has 295 assets, including nearly 140 patrol vessels and 18 submarines. That makes a coastal assault foolish. India would manage to fend it off while preparing internally for any forces that do land. And any country that gets past India's navy will find a huge military waiting for them. India's army is one of the world's largest, boasting 1.45 million active personnel, along with nearly the same number of reserves. There are also many paramilitary groups, with global firepower stating that membership in these groups numbers over 2.5 million. And even along the LAC, the previously mentioned border that India shares with China, the country has over 50,000 troops stationed, along with a ton of artillery and equipment. That means India is aware of its one potential weak spot, and it's done more than enough to ensure that nobody can exploit it. The sheer manpower an invader would have to fight through, combined with geographical issues that affect traversal, make India a terrible choice for an invasion in 2024. And with that, you have our list of 8 countries that are practically impossible to invade. Whether it's due to terrain, the sheer strength of its fighting forces, or the toughness of the people who will simply keep fighting even if a country manages to invade, all 8 of the nations on this list would make an invading force think twice before it took its chances. But what do you think? Are our reasons for each of these countries being impossible to invade sound? Or can you see a tactical route into any of them that an invading force could use? Perhaps you have ideas for other countries that should be on the list. Let us know what you think in the comment section below. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.